Alright, this is a review of Imperial Settlers. It's a game that came out this year, released at Gen Con. And there's been quite a few people who have done playthroughs of this, like Grey Elephant. So I don't see any reason to really go over how to play the game. But I will point out some of the features of the game that make it interesting. Right now in front of you I have just sort of a layout of a board. I've just kind of seeded it. You don't start with cards out like this, but I've sort of seeded it to sort of show you how the game works. You're going to be playing cards from your hand, and they're going to be going out onto this tableau here, and you'll be producing resources, and these resources will be used to get other cards or take actions on cards. But right now what I have out here is the top row is a production, and the production phase happens at the beginning of each round. You're going to be producing all of these resources. You're going to start with some card drafting, but then you're going to be producing all of these resources, and I've sort of done all of my production. I'm going to be getting all of these resources and workers. These are the workers, and I have wood for resource, and I have some gold, and I got that from my base production here, and I have some cards that produce. For example, I get a raise token and a worker here, a couple of woods, and a gold right now on top of my base production here. One of the interesting things I think about the game is each faction is able to store a certain type of resource at the end of a round. So for example, the barbarians can store workers, and each faction has something different that they store. So I don't have to worry about using up my workers. I can always save them. But all my other resources are going to disappear at the end of a round if I don't use them. So I think that's a pretty interesting feature of the game, because it forces you to use up, and you can't really hoard too much other than your base resource. It forces you to take action with them. This next row here is a feature row, and these cards, what these cards allow you to do is, for example, this one here is each time you build a black building, you gain a gold and a point. And this one here is for each time you build a pink building, you gain a gold and a point. So these are things that can be ongoing actions based on what other cards you play. And then I have some cards that you can actually take actions with by placing whatever resources you need to activate it right on the card. For example, this one is spend a worker and draw 2 cards, keep one, discard the other. So to do that, you take one of my workers and put it here. You put it on the card to indicate that you've taken the action. And then I would draw a card. Draw 2 cards and keep one and discard the other. So I have a choice. I have a faction deck which is unique to my faction I'm playing, and a common deck which is a deck that everybody can draw from if you want. And the cards are, the common cards go on this side, faction cards are going on this side. And when I get to draw cards, I can choose which deck. So maybe I'll draw one off of this one, maybe I'll draw one off of this one, and I would get to choose one and keep it. This one is each time you raise, you gain a point. And this one is spend a worker and a raise token, and you gain 3 points. So let's say I'll keep this one. The other one's discarded. And that's what that would do. So some workers are going to be able to place out here. Sometimes you get cards where you can actually use it twice. This one here is a one-time use. So on your turn, you're going to be taking, various actions, playing cards, building cards, taking some actions with your cards that are already out. One of the things that you can do with your cards, and this is a game that falls into that category of, I have a card and it can be used for multiple things, and I really like games that have this mechanic, and I've noticed there's a plethora of games coming out now that that follow this type of thing, where you have a card and you can use it for multi-uses. It seems like there's a ton of games coming out this year with this. It's almost replacing worker placement as like sort of the main in vogue mechanic now. I don't mind it because I really like the mechanic, but I can see that the market is getting really flooded with these types of games. But anyway, some of the things you can do with a card is you can build it so that you can have access to the actions on it. You can, in this case here, your faction cards, you can make a deal. And to make a deal, you just spend a food, and you're going to flip the card upside down, and then in the production phase, you're going to be able to get that resource, and the deals go up in here. So that's one thing you can do with the card. These common cards are, you can also raise them by using one of your swords here. This is a raise token. You can raise it for one out of your hand and get these two resources. You can also spend 2 raise tokens and actually raise somebody else's building, and you'll be able to get their resources, and then they get to flip the card, get a foundation, which can be used to build one of the requirements for building a building. A lot of these, particularly your faction buildings, require a foundation to begin with, meaning that you have to discard one of your cards to build it. When you get raised, though, you can use that card as a requirement for that. So I like that the cards have all of these different options for it. So I think that I tend to like games where that mechanic is present. I mean, that's basically what you're doing on your turn, is playing with the cards, using the actions, and trying to build up a little bit of a machine here that will eventually, towards the end of the game, generate points. And the cards themselves also have points on them. Like your faction cards generate 2 points, and these other cards generate, the common cards generate 1 point at the end of the game. And that's basically the flow of the game. So, what are the pluses and minuses of this game? Well, I think overall, one of the features I really like a lot about it is that there are 4 very distinct factions, and the factions really do play out differently, and they have some strengths and weaknesses. For example, these barbarians, they've got, let's see, for example, they've got like this Dark Chapel card here, which is if you spend a raise token, or 2 of them to raise somebody else's, to immediately raise a card from hand or an enemy building, you can discard any number of goods you receive and gain 2 points for each good. So, the different factions have different sort of specialties for generating points. I like that a lot, and I think that's it's really hard to pull off a game where you have distinct factions and have it work well, because there's it's so hard to balance that problem of having different factions that work well and are distinct but are also balanced. So you've got, the Romans here, and they've got their own set of cards. Let's see if I can find some interesting ones here. Each time you build a Roman building, you gain a gold and a point. Spend a stone, you get a point, maybe activated twice. Spend a worker to take one enemy deal and add it to your own deals. That's a pretty nasty card right there. So, here's the Egyptian deck here. You've got choose an enemy building and mark it with an Egypt token. For the rest of the round, the marked building is treated as your own. That's one of the things the Egyptians can do. The Sphinx. Each time you gain at least 2 points, you gain 1 more. So the factions really do have a pretty different set of cards. The Japanese faction's different because normally your faction buildings can't be raised, but the Japanese buildings can be raised. But the thing about the Japanese faction buildings is they're often really cheap to build, like very few resources. This is the Geisha House prediction. You get for one worker for each pink building in your empire, maximum 3. This faction does a lot with the apples, and so that's pretty neat. I haven't played the game enough to know if the factions really are balanced or not, but I know the designer here, Ignacy, is very well known for the development of his games, and I'm certain that a lot of work went into testing these factions out. But I haven't played it enough to really tell if some are more balanced than others. I can tell you that, like, for example, the Barbarians are definitely one of the easier factions to play, so they seem more out of whack at the beginning because they're just much easier to play, I think. So I think the Egyptians are the hardest faction for me to play. I haven't quite figured out how to really optimize that particular deck, but having a lot of fun with it so far. I really like games that have that sort of asymmetrical. I wouldn't say it's completely asymmetrical because the way you play your cards out is fairly similar, but each deck does have its own unique feel to it. So that's a definite big plus in my book. Let's see. I like that you have a combination of playing out your cards and creating your engine, as well as being able to use workers and actually take actions on your cards. I think that's a nice mechanic. Anyone buying this game, this is not a game where you're kind of playing out your own tableau and you're sort of isolated and you play out your own thing, like if you're playing St. Petersburg, for example, you're playing out your own tableau and no one's going to touch your tableau. But in this game, there is a lot of interaction. Your cards will be attacked, and you will be having to attack other players if they get out, certain cards you're just not going to want them to have. And sometimes you're just going to play out these raise tokens just because you have them, because you might lose them. I think I can't remember what faction it is. I think it's the Romans that get to keep them. Yeah, the Romans are the faction that gets to keep these, but everybody else has to play these if you have them, or you're going to lose them. So if you have 2 of these raise tokens, you're either going to raise a card out of your hand, or you're going to try probably to raise somebody else's card if they have a powerful one you want to get rid of. And if you want to play well in this game, you're going to have to do that. For example, like the Japanese deck here, if you just let these easy, cheap to build cards get out and not do anything about it, the person's going to just be racking up points. So you have to attack other players in this game to do it well. And I think the book mentions like a variant where you can take that out of the game. I just wonder though if that would take some of the balance out of the game too, because I just can't imagine letting like the Japanese faction just run wild with these cheap faction cards. I don't know. I don't think it. I think the game was designed to be played with that interaction, and that part of that interaction is part of the balance of the game. It's part of the balancing of the empires. So, you know, if you're averse to that type of thing, this is not going to be a great game for you. And I have to say, you know, my wife and I, we tend to not like that type of mechanic as much. And I have to say, when we play the game out, we're probably nicer than you should be to play it. And probably we would never be able to get to a very high level play with this game, because we're not going for the cutthroat play as much. We tend to want to play our own boards and leave each other alone. And you know, the more we play it, the more we're starting to use these things against each other, because we know you kind of know, you know, you have to. You can't just let somebody build an engine and just run wild with it, especially when you can knock out some of their best cards. And to balance that, though, when you raise somebody's building, they're going to get a wood resource, and they're going to get the flip side of their card in a foundation. So they're going to be able to build out another card very quickly if you raise them. So I really like that piece of it. It takes that sort of meanness of destroying other people's things and gives you some benefit from it. So I think that tones down a little bit that sort of what otherwise would be really harsh player interaction, and it tones it down a little bit, so you don't feel like you're totally lost when someone raises your buildings. And the other thing is, your faction buildings can't be raised unless you're playing the Japanese faction. So, I mean, you can just not play the Japanese faction if you want to have some level of protection. And you have these shields too, which also make it harder to raise a building. So if you have that on there, instead of 2 raise tokens, it costs 3. So yes, you do have to go after the other players, but it's not, you don't feel totally destroyed when somebody goes after your stuff, I guess, unless you get really ganged up on in a multiplayer game. I most of the times when I play, I usually play games 2-player with my wife and I, so you know, I don't know how that would work out. I mean, I suppose in a multiplayer game somebody could really get ganged up on in it. But probably what people would do in a multiplayer game is kind of go after the people who they think are winning and try and raise their buildings first. So that part of the game, that's the one part of the game that isn't as appealing to me. And I definitely would have preferred a game where that factor wasn't in it, and you can just build out your own tableau on your own. It's not so bad that it's taken a lot of enjoyment out of the game. I still like the game. I just prefer games that you don't have to have a lot of that player interaction, or that sort of meanness type of player interaction. I don't mind player interaction. I just don't like necessarily going out and destroying what somebody else has. That isn't my favorite type of feature in a game. So the more I play it, the more I realize, I mean, you can't avoid the part of the game where you're destroying other people. You have to embrace it if you want to play well. There's just no other alternative. But it does have some features that kind of tone down the damage to you. a little bit. So it kind of works out. I still like it because of that sort of mitigating feature. I tend to like a lot of games that can be played with 2-player. In fact, when I buy a game, it has to be a good game that can be played with 2 players, and I think this one plays well with 2 players. I haven't played it with more than 2 though, so I don't know how well it plays with 3 and 4, but I can say it does play well with 2. And the first time I played it, I was like, yeah, this is nice. I wasn't like, wow, wow. But after we've played it about 5 times now, it's really starting to grow on me more. I like the feel and the flow and the different ways you can kind of build out your cards. The cards have there's a lot of ways you can get points in this game. I kind of like that. You can go out your outright building of your faction cards gives you 2 points outright, and that's going to add up big time. There are a lot of these feature cards that will give you points. Some of these cards are tied to the color. There are some feature cards in here that says like for every pink building you have in your empire you can get a point, and those can be powerful if you build up the cards of the matching color. So the colors do matter. Some of the colors add to some of the powers of the cards, which is interesting. So as you're recruiting, I like the very simple drafting mechanism that's in the game. You get to draft cards, and you can take into consideration the color of the card, the action of the card, or even like you might want a card that is good to raise because you need it. So there's a choice. It's not like a random draw off the deck, so I do like that. So there's some choice of a lot of different strategy and a lot of different ways I think you can win. I like games where you build up an engine, and this definitely has that aspect to it. Like I said, I mentioned St. Petersburg earlier. St. Petersburg to me is just way too dry at this point. I mean, I think St. Petersburg is a good game, but I think it's seen its time, so to speak. I think something like this has got a lot more variety, just like built right into the deck. With the multiple ways you can build your cards in multiple different ways you can get points. St. Petersburg is kind of a rush for aristocrats, and everybody's going after the same cards and such, whereas this, you have your own decks, you have your own different way to play it out, and the way the cards interact are very different, and this common deck is so huge that there's going to be a lot of cards that don't come out in a game. You really don't have any idea what's going to come out. I suppose in that sense that there is some level of randomness factor, because there are definitely cards in your deck that are definitely better than other cards, or cards that are going to be playing better for whatever strategy you're going to go to, and so there is some level of luck as to what you draw out. Is it going to work with what your plan is, or can you adapt your plan to what you're drawing out in your deck? Because sometimes you're just drawing random cards, and sometimes you're drafting, and you don't have any control over what random cards you draw out. But I still prefer that to games where you know every card in the deck, you know every card that's probably going to come out. I prefer having some level of that randomness because it keeps the game a lot more fresher, and it also gives you, depending on what you might draw, you might not play the same strategy every game. I mean, you probably can't play the same strategy every game because what you draw early on is probably going to lead you down another path that you're going to have to adapt to. So I do like that aspect of it. Another game sort of in that sort of engine building type of genre is like Eminent Domain, and I actually own that one too. And Eminent Domain is an excellent game. And I find the differences between these two is enough to say, yeah, I can own both, and they're not really. They feel differently enough that I can own both. I am very content with this game now, so I don't need to run out and try to find another engine building, tableau building card game with multi uses of the cards right now. So I'm pretty happy with it. I would give it a thumbs up rating. Whether or not it's right for you, the big factor I think is that player interaction piece. If that's going to be something that would work for you, or not work for you, if you're averse to it. If it was any more vicious than it is, even just a hair more vicious than it is, I probably wouldn't like it as much. It really pushes the upper limit of what I want to see in a game like this. So it's really close, but we're gonna hold on to it, and we've had fun with it so far. All right, let's check out what the geek says here. All right, we have Ockel92, and he's rated this pretty highly at a 10 here. Game feels good to play. In the first round, you might take 3 turns. By round 5, you might be taking 10 or more. And I think that's true because the length of the turns, or the length of the rounds, increases exponentially as you get further into the game. As you build up what you can do and all the actions you can take on the board and your resources and workers that you can place, by the end of the game there's a lot of actions and things you're going to be doing, which is pretty nice. One of the things about the game I almost feel, with at least with 2 players, is sometimes it kind of ends maybe a little too quickly as you've got your engine going, but another round, if you're taking that many actions by round 5, I cannot imagine what round 6 would bring you. It would increase the game probably by a half an hour adding another round. So yeah, 5 rounds is pretty good. All right, let's take a look at Pastratius. And I have to look up what these names are sometimes, what they mean. But apparently, Pastratius was a tyrant of Athens. Born an aristocrat, he gained military honors early, became the first tyrant in 560 after claiming an attempt had been made on his life, and appealing to the people to grant him a bodyguard, which he used to help seize the Acropolis. Interesting. Anyways, he says another 10 for another game of Portal awesomeness. And Portal Games has been putting out some great games. They're one of my favorite publishers right now because of the quality of the games they're putting out and the uniqueness of a lot of the games they're putting out. Let's see, excellent 2-player game, totally agree. The art components, they will annoy some. It's true, the comic cartoonishness nature of the cards is a little annoying, and it's reminiscent of the Settlers video game. But I like the artwork. Let's see, another thing. One of the most exciting aspects is the promised periodic release of expansions, and I'm really looking forward to expansions too. And I think this game is going to have some support for a while, and that's another added plus, I think, to a game like this, is there's going to be support out there for it, and it's going to be more expansions, and it's going to add a lot to the game as it ages. All right, here's something from Soccer Star. And I'm not reading the whole thing, but down here it says the Egyptian faction is far and way better than the other 3. A new player playing this faction can beat even experienced players playing another pretty regularly. The Egyptians in the hands of an experienced player will probably win 99 times out of 100. Every time something like this is brought up, you are going to see just as many people claiming, no, the Egyptians are not overpowered, they're wrong, they're just fanboys, they can't stand to have criticism brought against them again. Well, I guess I haven't played the game enough to really know. I had a hard time playing the Egyptians, but I think that's an argument in this game, because the game has asymmetrical teams or asymmetrical factions, that it's really hard to balance those kinds of things out. So, that's definitely always a concern with when you have asymmetrical play, that one faction is going to be stronger than the others just because it's so hard to balance it out. In fact, in general, the only thing I wish they did was put more factions in the game. They announce unashamedly in the rulebook that expansions are in the works, and not only will we get new factions, but the ability to build our own faction decks by mixing cards from all factions. Until then, though, with the varied decks and playstyles, playing the same four will get old. Nobody wants to play with the Egyptians in the game. Okay, I don't know how I feel about that quite yet. Alright, Mr. Nuts says, first impression was not good. It's a resource conversion hell, and the factions in our game, Barbarians and Romans, didn't feel especially distinct. And the faction cards didn't feel especially distinct from the common cards. There is a lot of resource conversion, and I think that's true. And I think he's got a point about the civilizations not feeling especially distinct. They have some differences, but they're not so... They still play the same way. It's just they have certain advantages and disadvantages and some cards that are different. But they don't... Yeah, I kind of agree with that. They don't feel especially distinct. Alright, Fizzle says, in general, having different factions with somewhat different starting powers, strengths, and weaknesses seems like a good idea to add some variety. For the factions included in the game, however, the asymmetry seems to be so strong that you either follow the route your faction dictates or go under. You're actually not in a position to choose which path you would like to take. With the strategy already chosen for you, it pretty much comes down to drawing the cards in correct order, producing buildings first, VP buildings later. In contrast to, for example, Race for the Galaxy, there simply isn't enough card churn to overcome unhelpful draws. I think this is a legitimate point. I don't think it ruins the game. And, the first part, I'll address the first part first. As far as having your choice already made for you as to what your strategy is going to be when you pick up your faction, I think with any deck builder, there's a point very early in the game where you make a decision as to what route you're going to take, and that's it. So, either you make it at the beginning of the game or you make it like a couple of hands into the game. I don't really see what the difference is. I think there's less choice in any deck builder. You're either going to choose a route and that's it, And same thing with this game. It's no different. This part about, though, the churn, though, is a bit of an issue, I think. The way your cards come out can give you an advantage. And there are certain cards you're going to want at certain times in the game. And you don't churn your deck over very much, so, the order is probably even more important how they come out. It can affect how your game goes. Whereas a game where your deck is cycled a lot more, you're going to have more chances to get out what you need when you need it. So I think that is a legitimate concern or criticism of the game, though it doesn't bother me too much. So overall, despite the negatives, legitimate negative points, I still enjoy this game and definitely recommend it.